Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the first of 2 lectures to cover cetacean foraging. As we get started, we'll look with the Mysticetes first, and we'll look at some of the trends in the Mysticeti feeding approaches, followed by 2 of the major techniques for foraging, which are called skimming and gulping. And finally, we'll look at the humpback whales, which do something very unique called bubble netting. So when we first take a look at the cetaceans, we're going to use Mysticetes as kind of a foundation from which we will compare the Odontocetes, or the toothed whales, to later on. So one of the things about the Mysticetes is that they all tend to feed in shallow waters. In other words, we don't really see Mysticetes feeding in any depth greater than 500 meters. So because they tend to feed in shallow waters towards the surface, we also don't see any of the extreme diving adaptations that we would see for some of the other marine mammals, including the sperm whale, which is really an Odontoceti, it's not a Mysticeti, and some of the deep diving pinnipeds. And the reason for this is because Mysticetes are actually quite low on the food chain, which is something of an anomaly. They're very, very large in size, but they actually are only up a couple steps on the food chain. If we look at the basic food chain, you have something that starts with using sunlight energy, and those are going to be our phytoplankton. These are going to be little diatoms and dinoflagellates that tend to use sunlight energy as their source of food. And then you've got the smaller animals that are consuming them, including things like krill, which are small shrimp, copepods, etc. Those are respectively called the zooplankton. And so the Mysticetes are actually going to be one up from that, consuming mostly zooplankton. Since the zooplankton's food is at the surface, the zooplankton tend to be at the surface, and therefore the Mysticetes tend to be close to the surface as well. So when we look at different ways that Mysticetes can actually eat, we come up with 3 major techniques: skimming, gulping, and then a third one called suction feeding. Now, skimming is basically the idea that you skim along the surface of the water while swimming really slowly. So usually you're looking at a big whale, big baleen whale with its mouth wide open, just basically skimming the top of the water and taking in anything that they can. Gulping is a little bit more practiced, where you actually have a whale that's chasing some area of prey, and then what they do is they actually take a gigantic gulp all at once in one feeding event that's called a lunge. So you can think of them as just kind of lunging in the water column and gulping a very, very large amount of water that hopefully contains a large amount of prey. And then the suction feeding is probably the lesser known of all 3, and it's a rather interesting technique that uses food that might be found in the mud. And in this technique, you actually get a whale that's going to go down into the mud and open its mouth and basically scoop up or suck up a bunch of mud, and then basically push out all of the muddy water against their baleen and trap any of the organisms that might have been in the mud against their baleen plates. And so this is called suction feeding. They suck up the mud and then they push it out and they trap any of these bottom organisms, which are also known as benthic organisms. So for this lecture, we're going to look at the first 2, which is skimming and gulping. So let's go ahead and start with skimming. So skimming, as you may recall from an earlier lecture, is performed almost exclusively by the Balenidae. These are going to be the primitive Mysticetes, which include the right whale species and the bowhead whale. And you may also recall that we talked about some of the anatomical adaptations for skimming. Skimming is going to require very, very long baleen, and to fit that long baleen, you have to have a pretty large head. So these are going to be animals that look a little stockier. They've got really large heads, and of course they have very long baleen. So when you are looking at skimming as your primary foraging technique, what can you get with that? Well, here's the deal. You can pretty much get anything that is large enough to be trapped in your baleen, but not so large that it has the ability to swim away from you. So that's kind of the the group that you're looking at there is what isn't going to swim away from you. And remember, these are very slow swimming whales, so they don't really have the ability to chase their prey. They pretty much have to be able to take in anything that can't swim away from them, which means that most of the larger food items are going to be excluded. So in that sense, we might say they're somewhat opportunistic feeders. They take the opportunity to feed on whatever will come into their mouths and be trapped against the baleen. But unfortunately, that usually means that what that is tends to be smaller and therefore not of not a very high nutritional value or caloric value. So what are we really looking at then? Mostly very small organisms known as copepods. To give you an idea of just how big copepods are, if you take a water sample from the ocean, chances are there's copepods in there, but it requires a microscope to see them. That's how small they are. You're being generous if you say they are the size of a rice grain. So that's the majority of the food that is obtained through skimming. Now, they'd probably prefer to have something more nutritious like krill, but unfortunately, krill usually has the ability to get away from them. So most of their food is based on the lower value copepods. Because the copepods have lower value, these animals probably have to spend more time feeding than the faster gulpers. Also, it has been hypothesized that some of the lower rates of gestation and survivorship among the calves are due to the low caloric value of the copepods. In other words, the right whales and the bowhead whales are always struggling to get enough food to feed themselves, let alone have enough leftover calories to actually support and nourish a newborn calf. So it's been hypothesized that if they could actually capture larger amounts of food or food with higher caloric values, they might actually have higher gestation rates and survivorship rates among their newborns. It's an interesting hypothesis that suggests that these whales are kind of always in a state of struggle in terms of making sure they have enough food. So what about the gulpers? The gulpers are much more diverse. The gulpers are going to include pretty much all of the rorquals, which are going to be very slender and fast swimmers. And because of this, they can actually chase down dense pockets of fast-moving prey, including fish. And what they try to do is they gulp everything at once. Now, you may remember one of the features of the rorquals is what's called a ventral groove. A ventral groove is going to be on the underside of the belly, and you can see here in this minke whale, there's one flipped upside down, so you can see those ventral grooves. Those ventral grooves, of which there are 70 to 80 or so, allow the throat to expand fully to engulf up to 70% of their body mass in one lunge. Now, not all of that is going to be food. They're basically trying to engulf one giant large gulp of water, and they're hoping that in there is going to be also a good amount of food. So what are some of the dynamics of gulping? As you might expect, gulping is very energetically expensive. If you were to try to imagine that you were a rorqual whale and you were going to gulp, this is what you'd be looking at. You'd be looking at basically opening up part of your body, in water no less, which of course has a lot more drag, and then taking in this huge amount of water, getting your mouth all the way around it, which would be difficult. And then you'd have to push out the water. So you can't keep all that water in you. You're going to have to actually take your ventral grooves and contract them so that they spit out the water and move the water from the mouth out into the ocean. So you're basically expelling the water through your baleen and capturing all the organisms among your baleen plates and then using your big tongue to wipe them out. So it's a very energetically expensive process, and because of that, rorquals cannot lunge indiscriminately. In other words, they need to know that they're going to get a lot of food in one gulp, otherwise it's not worth it to them in terms of energy expended to actually do the gulp. Interestingly enough, the larger the body size, the fewer lunges needed. So it's estimated that a blue whale might only need about 80 lunges a day, where a minke whale might need more like 350 lunges a day. So the larger you are, the fewer gulps it's actually going to take to get your caloric need for the day, which again is going to be something that favors large size. And then of course also because the prey are larger, because you're actually chasing them down and capturing them before they can get away, rorquals tend to have prey of much higher caloric value compared to skimmers. So what exactly are they getting? Well, in the northern hemisphere, most of the rorquals actually feed on kind of a diverse array of food, including, but not limited to, krill, any copepods that might be in there, things like salps, squid, and even small fish like herring. Whereas in the southern hemisphere, they tend to feed more exclusively on krill, along with any copepods that might be in the mix there. So the northern hemisphere diet seems to be more eclectic, and the southern hemisphere diet seems to be more exclusively of krill. So finally, we turn to our humpback whales. Humpback whales are extraordinary in their ability to cooperatively forage. Cooperatively forage means that they actually feed in concert with some of the other whales in their group. This is unlike most of the other mysticetes, which tend to feed as solitary units or possibly a mother-calf pairing, but otherwise they just feed by themselves. These guys are actually going to work together in order to feed. And one of the techniques that they use is called bubble netting. And bubble netting is really neat, so I want to go ahead and describe it here for you. Essentially, their main goal is to eat herring, which is a small type of fish, a small bait fish, maybe about as big as the palm of your hand. And what they're going to do is they're actually going to get underneath a school of herring. Now, again, these are gulpers. So what they want to do is they want to get as many herring into one gulp as possible. So how would you do that? Well, efficiently, if you could, you'd want to try to get the herring to actually school up in one nice tight aggregation, one tight school, so that when you come through with one gulp, you capture many more herring than if the herring are kind of spread out a little bit. So how do they group them together? Out of fear. They do so with bubbles. So we've actually shown in laboratory settings that herring have an aversion to bubbles. So what these guys do is they actually get underneath a school of herring and actually start circling around. And when they circle around, they actually exhale. And as they exhale, that creates bubbles. If they do so continuously, it creates what's called a bubble net, a big circle of bubbles. Well, the herrings, terrified of the bubbles, move away from the bubbles and towards the center of that bubble net. Well, then what happens is all the humpback whales all at once and together in concert of that group all come up in the center of that bubble net with their mouths agape at the same time and basically cash in on a field day of herring, getting many, many, many more herring than they would if they hadn't been aggregated together by that bubble net. And so in the picture here on the right, you can see these multiple humpbacks coming up to the surface. It's really quite shocking if you get to watch it. Coming up, all with their mouths agape, swallowing huge amounts of herring in their mouths. And then, of course, they close their mouths and push out all the remaining water, trapping a nice catch of herring for the day. And with that, I will see you for the next part of this lecture.